Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we have a doozy, an absolute marathon of a chorale, Christ ist erstanden, which translates to Christ is risen. This is a two-pager, a complete two-pager, and we've looked at this particular text before, but it was quite some time ago. It was BWV 66, and that too was another long chorale, so it must just be a longer form that Bach associates with. This chorale has a lot going on. This was not an easy analysis. One of the more difficult chorales I've analyzed as far as Bach's more tonal chorales are concerned. Lots of nuances here and there about whether or not you're dealing with direct or common chord modulations, you know, the usual, but kind of amplified by the fact that Bach is doing it sometimes in very close proximity to one another. We're just going to hop right into the analysis because I anticipate this one's going to be a longer one. So no key signature. We start on D minor, and all the way at the end of the chorale, we end on D major. So we have another chorale just like yesterday's that has some key signature disagreement, meaning that we typically associate one flat in the key signature with D minor. It's B flat. That is the flat that's added to D minor to make it minor. Even though we have no key signature here, I reckon that it has to do with Bach using the aggregate of all of the keys that are explored in this chorale and deciding that, well, B natural occurs more often than B flat, therefore there's no need for a key signature. But from an analytical standpoint, it does complicate things a bit, or confuses things. It's not super complicated, it's just confusing because sometimes you're in D minor and you don't immediately see a B and think B flat. It has to be B natural. But we start off in the key of not in D minor. We actually start off in A minor, which is what the key signature suggests, but our first cadence is in the key of D minor. One might even go as far to say as it is a subdominant cadence in some cases if you don't feel like we've moved out of the key of A minor, but I think with this B flat here, as well as this G natural that resolves down to F natural, this really does feel like we've clearly established D minor, or rather D minor has been clearly established. We didn't do anything, Bach was the one that composed it. So we start things off with a Plagal Cadence after our D minor chord, which is not our tonic yet, it's actually our 4 chord. We have a passing 7th here in the tenor before we get E, B natural, F, and G, and we have another minor dominant. We've been seeing quite a few minor dominants recently. I wonder if there was just something on Bach's mind in terms of the modal influence or the step away from needing the leading tone, but this also sort of verifies that old hypothesis I had about 5 chords, or minor 5 chords more specifically, being contextualized by the melody, because the melody doesn't change, and because the third of the chord is in the melody, if you harmonize a 5 chord around this G natural, it's going to be minor in quality. So this is one of the cases of that being true. But we see that that's not always the case with Bach. Sometimes he just harmonizes a 5 chord and he's the one who inputs the third. So we have a little delayed passing 7th here. This F is a 9/8 suspension. It's this E that's our chord tone. And then we have C, C, E, and A, which is our tonic triad, A minor and first inversion. And then we have 4 non-chord tones all happening off of the harmonic rhythm. Happens to spell G sharp diminished, G sharp, B, B, and D. It's a 7/6 chord, and if you've watched my videos in the past, chances are you know what chord is coming after this. It's an A minor chord in root position, A, E, A, and C, 1-7-6-1, very common chord progression in the chorales. And this is one of the more interesting aspects of this chorale is this tonic triad here. I think we're actually modulating over a minor dominant, and the reason why I think this modulation over the minor dominant is more justified than other situations where you could have analyzed a common chord modulation over a minor dominant is because Bach has already established the precedent that the minor dominant is a chord that's part of the vocabulary. I kind of look at this phrase as separated into two parts. We have the first part of the phrase that goes 4, 5, 1, and then it sort of allies with this part of the phrase that starts with 5 and then turns into the cadence. So the minor 5, seeing both usage in A minor and D minor, they kind of complement one another. Maybe I'm just overreaching here, but all in all, I think this is the point at which we modulate. It's a relatively short phrase, and we're exploring both A minor and D minor. It just feels like this is the right place. This is where it feels like it's modulating. So I don't think we've modulated before because the G sharp just feels like it's resolving to A and we're still in A minor. And I don't feel like we've modulated later because we have B flat going on. We will see a flat 2 later in the chorale, a little bit of a spoiler, but if you've listened to the chorale you might have heard that already, or if you've already looked at the score. Little neighbor tone going on here. This E is a chord tone. Then we get B flat, D, A, and D. I reckon this A is a 9/8 suspension over the bass. And we actually get B flat, D, G, and D, which would be a 4/6 chord, G minor over B flat. And this C is a little delayed passing tone. It's interesting here how this first phrase really feels like we're stepping into the old world, right? We're cadencing from below 5, 6, 7, 1, but not raised 6th and 7th scale degrees, which are pretty integral to establishing that tonal sound. I mean, even Renaissance composers would withhold the use of the leading tone until you get to the cadence to point towards what was being implied as a final or a tonic, some type of pitch center. But in this case, we have 5, 6, 7, 1, also contributing to this idea of natural minor, keeping it consistent across all of the chords in the measure, including the minor dominant. But the cadence is delayed a little bit. We get some ornamentation here with this 4/3 suspension in the alto. And then we go to D, D, F, and A, this E being like a lower ornament as well, before we finally arrive on this longer F here, giving us D minor entirely contextualized as our tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead to our next phrase, we stay in the key of D minor. This is one of the plainer phrases that we see, despite the fact that we do have an interesting chord progression in or within the phrase, but still, this is one of the tamer phrases that we have as far as the entire chorale is concerned. So we're still in the key of D minor. We start off with C sharp, A, E, and A. It's A major over C sharp, and that goes to D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad. We have some passing tones in the outer voices before we get F, A, C, and A. Kind of an interesting chord here. We get a 3 chord, 1 going to 3, a relatively uncommon progression, but really 1 can go anywhere, so we can write a pass here, even though it's one of the less likely places 1 goes. I sort of would expect 1 to go to 1/6 here, but 1/6 versus 3, for all intents and purposes, they're like the same chord. And then we get some chromaticism here in the alto, F, A, C sharp, and G. Not really an analyzable chord, but with these outer intervals here, or with these, not these outer intervals, I was thinking that they are functioning sort of as outer tendency tones, where G wants to go down to F and C sharp wants to resolve to D. So really what we have here is an implied 7 chord going to a tonic triad. So here we have 3 going to where I thought what 1 would go originally, 1/6, F, A, D, and F, D minor over F. And this F is just the bass leaping down an octave. We don't need to reanalyze anything. And then we get G, B flat, C sharp, carried from the earlier C sharp we saw, and E, which is C sharp fully diminished 7th over G, that is 7/4/3. And then we get a bit of transitive harmony here, or sorry, not transitive harmony, deceptive harmony. All of these, again, similar to what we saw earlier, 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm. We have B flat, F, D, and D, which is B flat major. That would be a 6 chord, so 7 going to 6 is just a dominant going to a stable triad that is not, or a tonic functioning triad that isn't the tonic. So 7 going to 6 or 5 going to 6 being the instances where we would have like a textbook, sorry, my hand is really close to the camera, deceptive progression. Before we get A, G, D, and E, I think this D is being repurposed as a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and what we're really getting here is a 7, which is a 5/7 chord. The way that the 6 could also be functioning as a way to break up the 7 to 5 progression, which I've talked about at length in the, not in a particular video, but in videos from the past, where 7 going to 5 is not really a progression. Both chords have the same function, and they're mostly consisting of the same pitch material, so it's not only just static, but just a prolongation of a desire to want to resolve. So breaking up the two dominant functioning chords with a chord like an intermediary chord is pretty neat. And then we have the end of our phrase with a perfect authentic cadence on D minor, D, F, A, and D, so 5/7, eventually resolving where we would expect to a tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead to the next phrase, we have a cadence in the key of F major. It is an imperfect authentic cadence, and I think the entire phrase is in the key of F major, starting right from the very beginning. D, A, D, and F spells another D minor chord, but in the key of F, that also happens to be our 6th chord, D minor. And then we have C, E, D, and G, this D being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. We know that a 5 chord is being implied here, but Bach, again, creating a very contrapuntal texture here by interrupting the resolution with this F here, as well as making the resolution almost like an ornament before we get to the actual resolution here that happens on this beat. So take this F with a grain of salt and then look to the second beat as where the actual resolution is happening. This B natural is also a non-chord tone. It's interesting that this B natural is here and not B flat. I guess there's an argument to be made that we haven't quite left the key of D minor yet because of this B natural, but also with B natural just being absent, you could make an argument that this is just bringing emphasis to C. Like with the B and the F going on, they could be tonicizing C, right? Because B is a tendency tone that wants to go to C, and F is a tendency tone which admittedly wants to go to E, but still is the tritone that wants to resolve outward to C major. So it's ultimately just functioning as a passing tone. I'm getting way too much into detail if I plan on getting through this entire chorale. Regardless, we do have 5, and instead of resolving where we would expect it to 1, Bach gives us a bit of a turnaround and delays that resolution. And when we get the resolution, it's actually somewhat unexpected, because this is amongst the most contrapuntally dense parts of the of the entirety of the chorale, even though that the inner voices are somewhat in unison here for a bit rhythmically, actually all the way until the cadence, but they create really interesting counterpoint with the outer voices. After our 5 chord, we have G, G, C, and G, and, or sorry, F, G, C, and G, and I would expect this to go to some type of G minor chord or G major chord, but we don't get that immediately. Instead, what we get is we go to B. After a while, we go to not G major, right? We don't actually get the resolution to G major, so this F is a passing tone. I think that we actually have some accented non-chord tones going on here with like this double suspension going on in the inner voices. C wants to resolve down to B, and G actually doesn't really resolve down anywhere. It's already a consonant interval over the bass, right? G over G is an octave, so that just ends up resolving down to a 6th. So I really think what's happening on the 8th note is what's part of the chord, and this D is actually part of the chord as well because it's echoed in the melody. We have G sharp, E, B, and D, which is E7 over G sharp. That would be 5, 6, 5 of 3. Now, what is an E7 chord doing in an F major context? Well, we would expect that to resolve to A minor, and if we look at the lower voices, we get what we would expect to be A minor, right? We have A and E, which is the outer outline of an A minor chord. We have B, which would resolve down to A, and also the melody as well has that C, but this E does not resolve down, or this E doesn't stay static. It actually resolves up to F, and I think actually what's going on here is we get a secondary deceptive progression where E major is resolving to F. If we were thinking in terms of A minor here, this would be like a 5 chord going to a 6 chord, but in the context of F major, this is like a secondary dominant going to the tonic. We have seen 5 of 3 go to 1 before in the past. It's just as far as secondary deceptive progressions are concerned, among the more uncommon variants. Of course, take that with a grain of salt because this is a contrapuntally dense section. I think there are other ways to interpret what's going on, but with the absence of B flat going on here, I really do think that this is the most likely outcome as far as extrapolating chords from the texture and what's going on. But after our tonic triad, things tend to simmer down. And actually, I guess before we move ahead, I suppose you could also analyze this tonic triad as a 3 chord. Of course, you could look at this F with a grain of salt, and you could just say that this B going down to A along with this E and this C is enough context to tell you this is an A minor chord. But regardless, I do think this is a secondary deceptive progression. It's just what it sounds like to me, especially with the inner voices being the sort of the final judges in terms of the context of what's going on harmonically. But 1 versus 3, they're very similar chords in the first place, so with the counterpoint, like I said, be a little leery of taking this as gospel. It's just my interpretation. We also have some passing tones going on here, very brief passing tones before we go to A, C, and F. It's like taking, oh, sorry, this is in first inversion. Speaking about A, C, and F, that's just another tonic triad in first inversion, just revoiced. And then we have B flats. We're starting to see more B flats as well. F, which is a chord tone actually, we don't need to mark it. D, which is a non-chord tone, and F again, which is B flat major in root position, which is a 4 chord in the key of F. And that takes us to G, B flat, E, and G, which is A, B flat, E, and G. It's actually this G here that I believe is our chord tone, G, B flat, E, and G, which is our tonic, our 7 chord, E diminished over G, 7, 6, 4 going to 7 is another variation on like a 2 going to 5. It's just a predominant going to a dominant chord following the cycle of falling fifths. We tend to see them more commonly in imperfect authentic cadences than we do in authentic cadences. There's probably a reason for that, but there's really no reason why, in theory, there should be a reason for that. It might just be because of the strength of the tones. But all in all, we do end up resolving where we would expect F major, F, C, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead, we have a phrase that's pretty clearly in the key of D minor, pretty much from the very beginning too, and we end the phrase in a half cadence. Now, we have another one of these situations where we have a common chord that leads to the dominant before our relative minor, and in the past, if you've seen a video of mine that has talked about this, you know that I kind of quarrel with the idea that maybe from a gestural standpoint, 5 going to 1 in the minor key right after the tonic triad of the relative major key because of the cross relationship between C sharp and C natural, you know, is a direct modulation happening here, or is it a common chord modulation? And I've been analyzing them as common chord modulations, but I do think there's a strong argument for the fact that they could be direct modulations as well, if anything just from a gestural standpoint, because there is a clashing of notes that are unlike in terms of their quality. But I am going to be consistent with my previous analysis and just call it a common chord modulation. We have F here, which is going to be repurposed as 3 in the key of D minor, and then we go to A major, C sharp, A, E, and A, which is our 5 chord in first inversion. Passing tone in the melody as well before we get D minor, D, A, E, and F. Bach loves this 9/8 suspension, especially with D minor chords. Maybe that's just a coincidence because we've been seeing a lot of D minor as of recent, but here, this 9/8 suspension, especially with this E in the alto, is just something that Bach loves to do. It's like this minor second, this really beautiful minor second that splits into a minor third. It's really, really commonly used touch by Bach, but regardless, our tonic triad is what's being implied here before we get E, G, D, and G, this D being a 7/6 suspension over the bass, and what's really being implied here is E, B flat, C sharp, and G, which is C sharp fully diminished 7th over E. That would be a 7/6/5 chord, and if you've seen this progression in the past, you probably know what chord's going to come next. It's D minor in first inversion, F, A, D, and A. I could pretty much bet everything on this chord progression because of how consistent it is. We have some passing tones in the not the lower voices, the outer voices, before we get D, A, D, and F. That's just taking our D minor triad and putting it in root position, so we'll just change the figured bass. A little brief neighbor tone here, as well as a delayed passing tone in the alto, before we get an interesting chord. Actually, we have D, G, B flat, and E. That would be E minor 7 flat 5 over D, and the reason why this D is also a lower suspension, right? It's like a 4, probably not a 4/5 suspension. It could be, what would it be, like a 3/4 suspension? No, like a 2/3 suspension underneath the melody, maybe. Yeah, that's probably the most likely configuration. It's probably a 2/3 suspension or a 9/10 suspension underneath the melody. But I think this is a chord tone because after this 2/4/2 chord, we would expect 5/6, and that's exactly what we get. After this little neighbor tone here, we get C sharp, G. Actually, this G is a chord tone, so let me go ahead and erase that non-chord tone marking. A and E spells A7 over C sharp, and that's exactly where we would expect a 2/4/2 chord to resolve. Let me go ahead and erase that and make it a little bit easier to read and less encroached on the next beat. And then we have D, F, A, and D, which is D minor in root position. That's where we would expect a 5/6 chord to go, or a 5/6/5 chord. A little brief neighbor tone here in the tenor as well before we get D, F, B, and D, which is kind of an interesting chord. That would be B diminished over D, which would be like a 6 diminished chord, but I don't really think that's contributing too much to the harmony of it all. The bass isn't moving, and I think the inner voices are moving too quickly. It's mostly this B natural being injected into the texture because I think Bach is trying to avoid the augmented second, which is augmented seconds aren't a bad thing, they're just uncommon and not really a reflection of like the scalar motion of what you see in single lines. So this B is an on-chord tone, this F is still a chord tone, and then we cadence on A major, A, E, C sharp, and E, which is our dominant in the key of D minor. Looking to the next phrase, we actually are going to see this phrase later on as well, and I had this phrase actually entirely in the key of D minor originally, but when you see the second iteration of this phrase, you're going to see why I now mark this as a modulation to the key of G minor beforehand, and I think it would have been a totally plausible way to analyze the phrase the first time around. I just felt like it was also analyzable in the key of D minor, and because it's such a short phrase, why contribute another modulation unless there was a really compelling reason to put it there? And now with the second iteration of this phrase, I feel like there is a compelling enough reason to put it there. So here we have a direct modulation to G minor. The next one is, in my opinion, not a direct modulation, but this one is. We start off with A actually resolving to some type of D major chord, so we do get the resolution here, but it's not a D minor chord, it's a a D major chord, F sharp, A, D, and D, which is just 5/6 in the key of G minor. D major is the dominant of G minor, but we do get the resolution here. So there is a common ground and like a flow from this A major chord to G minor, despite there not being a direct, or sorry, I need to be careful, this is a direct modulation, despite there not being a common chord, diatonically speaking, between the two keys in this case. We have some neighbor tones in the lower voices here before we get F sharp, A, C, and D, which is just taking our D major chord and turning it into a D7 chord in the same inversion. So we'll just go ahead and change the figured bass. And then this D and this F sharp are both chord tones. We don't need to analyze them as non-chord tones. And then we resolve to G minor, G, G, C, and D. However, we have one of these cases where we have a suspension in the alto, or just in any voice really, and Bach switches up the bass before we get the resolution. So we have a tonic triad being implied here. This D is a chord tone, this A is a passing tone, and then we get 1/6, which is just G minor and over D flat. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. And I do think this is where we modulate to the key of D minor, and the reason why I think we modulate here rather over this G minor chord, right, D, G, B flat, and D, is the fact that sometimes we see cadences or plagal cadences that end a section, I guess a section would be the appropriate way to refer to it as. They end a section in a plagal cadence that share a bass between the tonic and the subdominant, and that's exactly what's happening here. So I feel like the modulation is already underway at this point, and by the time we hit this 6/4 chord, we are already in the key of D minor. We have seen a cadence like this in the past, so I feel like at this point we're already thinking in terms of D minor, and this is just like I just said, a big plagal cadence. So D, G, B flat, and D, that's just taking our 4/6 chord and turning it into 4/6/4 chord. And this F sharp and this A are actually taking our D minor chord and voicing it as a major chord. And this is really what makes it feel like the end of a section as well, not just the plagal cadence that shares a bass with the tonic triad, but also the fact that we have this picardie third in the middle, or seemingly in the middle of the chorale. This feels like the end of a section in a multi-sectioned piece, a larger form. Like there's multiple layers of form, both at the sectional level and at the entire piece level. So this would be the final cadence of what I guess I'm calling the first section. And then we get some neighbor tones in the inner voices as well before we get another D major chord, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is another tonic triad, no need to reanalyze. So following our phrase that we just saw with a plagal cadence, we're going to see another plagal cadence here, this time in the key of F major, and I do believe we just start straight away in the key of F major. This D minor chord here, when juxtaposed with the D major chord we just ended with, does feel like a successor and continuing in the key of D minor until we see what's happening after the fact, and then it kind of feels more like F major than anything else. So this D minor chord is our tonic, and I'm rewriting one here because our previous tonic was major, but in the key of F major, it is also our 6th chord. We saw this earlier as well. Not the exact same thing, but still the same idea of taking a tonic and moving to the key of F through the 6th chord. We have a passing tone in the bass before we get F, C, E, and A. I reckon actually what's happening here is that this E is an accented non-chord tone, and by that same virtue this C must be an accented non-chord tone as well. So we could make an argument that this is a 3/7 chord, but I don't think actually that's what's happening. I think with the pairing of the inner voices being accented non-chord tones, just like kind of how we saw in the previous phrase, and just a convention that Bach makes use of from time to time, we're actually dealing with F, B, D, and A, which is B minor 7 flat 5 over F, and that would be another secondary dominant chord. That would be 7 4 3 of 5, because B is the leading tone to C, and C is our 5 chord, and this F gets further prolonged into the next beat. It's an accented non-chord tone, and where we resolve is actually E, C, B flat, and G, which would be a C7 chord over E, which is a 5 6 5 chord. So that's what I feel like makes sense here is when we pull out all of the chord or all of the tones that are most likely contrapuntal or accented non-chord tones, the progression we get is some type of tonicization of 5. And we would expect that to go to some type of 1 chord, which it actually does in this case, F, C, A, and A, which is our tonic triad, F major, and then we have G, G, B flat, and C, which gives us some semblance of a 5-7 chord. I'm not going to analyze it because the third of the chord is missing, and I feel like with a major a chord that uses a major or a minor triad foundationally before we add the 7th, the third is pretty crucial in terms of identifying its quality, so we need to have that there. But do know that there is a little bit of a passing 5 chord interrupting this 1 chord going to the next chord, which is just F major over A, C, F, and C. And in the same way that we have this 6 chord interrupting the 7 to 5 progression, we kind of have like a 5 chord interrupting a 1 to 1 progression, which doesn't really feel like a progression really, because we're not really introducing any new tones to the texture from a structural standpoint. It's just there though, but not entirely intact. Almost though. But this is an F major chord in first inversion. This F is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have B flat, C, F, and D. The C being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, or I guess it would be a 2-1 suspension over the bass. Am I reading that right? Yeah, it would be a 2-1 suspension, so the bass and the tenor are singing a unison by the time the tenor resolves. And this is a 4 chord, B flat major, before we cadence on F, F, C, F, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. So our next phrase takes us to the key of D minor, but unlike our Plagal cadence, let me go ahead and make that look more like a P, we are going to have a deceptive cadence at the end of this phrase. It's always cool when we see the deceptive cadence being used. And we have another move from F major to D minor, where F is the first chord we see. And this is actually the case that makes me feel like my common chord modulations are further justified because of the fact that we see 2 Fs next to one another, not just here. We see F going directly to an A major chord, then directly to a D minor chord. Of course, this is a little nuanced because if you really wanted to, you could analyze the C as an accented non-chord tone and instead treat this chord as a D minor chord in first inversion. The tones are there, and when only one voice is moving, we do have that ambiguity that arises when we see that. But I still analyze this as a tonic triad with a passing tone in the tenor, and I think this now in the key of D minor is our 3 chord, just to create some continuity here. And then of course that goes to A major over C sharp, exact same as we saw earlier, C sharp, E, E, and A, exact same as in the chord progression. Not so much the actual voicing of the chords and everything like that. The chords are actually spelled pretty much entirely differently. Actually, are they all that different? The tenor is different, but it ends up going down to the... They're actually a lot more similar than I just made it out to sound, but they're different enough to be considered their own things, I would say. This G is a little delayed passing tone, and then we get D minor, D, A, D, and F, our tonic triad, root position. We then have 3 passing tones in the upper 3 voices, leaving us with D, G, E, and G. Not really an analyzable chord here, maybe a bit of a 7 or a passing 2 chord being implied, but we don't have the full context to tell us whether we do or don't. Then we have D, F, F, and A, which is another tonic triad, but then we have 4 voices moving off of the harmonic rhythm again. That's when we know that typically speaking there is some type of, sorry I moved the score there, some type of subdivided chord progression going on here, and I think that that's what's happening here as well. C sharp diminished over E, which is a 7/6 chord, and if you've seen this chord progression, if not in the past 2 times earlier in this video, you know what chord's coming next. It's D minor in first inversion, F, A, D, and F. That's exactly what we get. We also have another passing tone in the bass here before we get A, D, and E. This D is a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and this D is echoing what's being suspended in the alto, but we know that A major is being implied here because of what it resolves to on the next beat. We know that a 5 chord is what's being implied. We get A, C sharp, and E on this beat, no need to reanalyze. a little delayed passing seventh here in the tenor as well, before we cadence not on D minor, but on B flat major, B flat, F, D, and D. The upper voices tell us D minor, the bass tells us B flat major. That's what makes it feel very deceptive. It's partially familiar, but different. Our expectations are subverted, hence the deceptive progression. Sorry, the deceptive cadence. Continuing along with our theme of, I guess, oscillating between D minor and F major, we are going to move to the key of D minor, and our second page ends, or sorry, our first page ends and leads into our second page that has a phrase that ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F, but we will get to it when we get to it. Sorry, I have to recenter my page here. And I do think we start off with a chord that is common between both keys. B flat major in the key of F major. In the key of F major is also our 4 chord. And then we have A, C, and F, which is our tonic triad first inversion. We then have E, G, C, and G. That is C major over E, which is 5/6. And then we have D, F, B, and G. It's kind of an interesting chord here, not B flat, just like we saw earlier, but B. So maybe what's going on here is potentially some type of 5/4/3 of 5 because of that B natural, now that we have all of the context there to tonicize the chord. Maybe, who knows? I'll mark it there because it does look like that is what's happening from a subdivided level. But we immediately go back to C afterwards, which is a good sign. E, G, C, and G. It's another 5/6 chord with a passing tone in the bass. And then we have G, G, C, and D. But this C is most likely a 4/3 suspension over the bass, and what's actually being implied is a 2 chord, so a bit of a turnaround, some transitive harmony. We're not exactly ready to go to 1, so we are approaching the tonic from a different direction. We're going up a 5th rather than down a 5th. And interestingly, after this 2 chord, we would expect 2 to go to another 5 chord and then turn us back around towards the tonic, but we go to another chord, which is kind of interesting. We have this delayed passing tone here, and we have A, E, B flat, and C. This B flat being a 9/8 suspension over the bass. A, E, A, and C is implying A minor, which is a 3 chord, which is earlier what we saw. That is, if we are drawing a comparison between the third phrase and this phrase right here, which I guess would be the, let's see, 4, 5, 6, 7, the 8th phrase of the chorale. This is actually the resolution that we were expecting earlier, and we don't see any Fs in sight to muddy or otherwise make the analysis more complicated. We actually just see 2 going to 3, which is very well what this analysis could have been if we didn't have the G sharp creating this chromatic bass line here. So we're seeing another more diatonic approach to the progression that we saw earlier in the third phrase. But after our 3 chord, we'll passing 7th here in the alto, and we have finally made it to the second page, which content-wise is about as long as the first phrase, so we are having quite a long video today. I am definitely feeling it. I'm almost 40 minutes into this video. Okay, but this phrase will end. Let me go ahead and consolidate my notes as well. Page turning has never been my strong suit. But our 3 chord actually does not resolve to a chord. It's not functioning as a predominant or anything. It is a 1 chord that we're going to resolve to. We have A, C, and F. A, C, and F rather, which is like I mentioned, F major over A, passing tone in the bass, and then we get F, G, C, and G. It's almost as if the bass is 1 note behind everything because of this figure that we have here, or we see this figure where Bach puts non-chord tones on the inner pair of 8th notes in a 4/8 note configuration here with some regularity. So E, G, C, and G is probably what Bach is implying here, which is a 5/6 chord, C major over E, and then we cadence on F, 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 C, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. So this next phrase is particularly interesting. We have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of C major, but that's not really what's interesting about it. What's interesting about it is that we go to C major through D minor, and this C sharp here really makes me feel like we have moved to the key of D minor. I suppose that there is an argument to be made here that we haven't moved to the key of D minor, I suppose, and that we're just in F major throughout the whole phrase. But I feel like what's going on in the bass, F, E, D, just looks like D minor, hovering around the dominant of D minor in the melody as well. And we also have like a long D minor scale fragment here of 5 going down to 1 here in the tenor. It just feels D minor like to me. So when we start off with this F major chord, F, A, C, and A, again another D minor phrase that starts with an F major chord, I feel like this is now our 3. And then we have 3 passing tones, 1 chromatic and 2 diatonic, E, G, C sharp, and A. We have another one of these 5 passing tones after a 3 chord. So Bach has established that F major moving to A major is like a codified chord progression, whether it is at the beginning of the phrase or alighting with the previous phrase. Kind of strengthens my argument that I feel like these are common chord modulations rather than direct. But again, I feel like whatever your opinion is on the matter, it's accurate. You could look at it either way. But after our A7 chord, we go to D minor, D, F, D, and A. No suspension this time. I guess you could technically say that this D is being held as like a long pedal tone in the bass, but it's not really functioning like a suspension. We have some passing tones in the melody and the tenor before we get another D minor chord, D, A, F, and D, and some more passing tones, one of them being a little delayed in the melody this time before we get our last D minor chord here, D, F, D, and A over this long D minor pedal, so we don't need to reanalyze. And we get some passing tones in the lower voices this time before we get D minor in first inversion, F, A, D, and F. And this is where I believe we move to the key of C major. This is now 2-6, and as we're closing in on a cadence, we would expect some type of 5 chord afterwards, but we don't. We don't go down a 5th, we go up a 5th, and after this passing tone in the bass, we get A, D, and E, almost as if we were expecting another one of these 4-3 suspensions, and we would go down to C sharp, and then cadence on D minor, but no, we're actually going to cadence on C major. It's kind of deceptive in that way. But regardless, this D is still a 4-3 suspension in the bass, and A minor is being implied. A, E, C, and E, which is a 6 chord in root position. And then we get D, F, C, and D. It's almost like Bach is playing with the idea of using this somewhat dominant chords. Like we have the makings of a dominant chord here. We're just missing the leading tone, like D in first inversion, that'd be a 1-6 chord. If this were A major, it would be 5, and if this were a D minor chord, it would be 1, but we don't quite get D minor. We get B diminished over D, so we get 6 going to 7-6, then going to C major, C, G, C, and E, which is our tonic triad in root position. It's a really fascinating phrase. I don't think I've ever seen this cadential configuration before, 2-6, 7-6, 1, but again, this isn't a topic I've really touched on in several videos actually, but imperfect authentic cadences, really all bets are off in terms of what types of chords you're going to see in the cadence. You're going to see all sorts of different inversions and predominant chords paired together, and I think that that's just a comment on the I in the IAC, the imperfectness, even though they're, one isn't any better or more perfect than the other. It's just using textbook terminology. So we finally come to the phrase that informed this one right here, where I said we move to the key of G minor, because here we have kind of a crafty way of using C major to get us to the key of G minor. It is a distant modulation, but C major and G minor do have chords that are in common with one another if you do factor in the idea that there are multiple forms of minor, if you subscribe to the fact that there are 3 separate minor scales. And in this case, C major could be interpreted as 4 in the key of G minor, and it could be used as a secondary or sorry, it could be used as a direct, I need to be careful using that word direct, because direct modulation actually means something. It could be used as a gateway that, I guess, in the context of melodic minor, is diatonic to the key. So after this 4 chord, we get F sharp, A, C, and D, another D major, foundationally D major chord, but this is actually D7, 5, 6, 5, and then we get G, B flat, and D, which is our tonic triad, G minor in root position. We then have C, F sharp, A, and D, which is another D7 chord, this time over C. This would be 5, 4, 2, and we would expect this to resolve to some type of G minor chord in first inversion, and that it does. This C is a lower suspension, perhaps over the, or under the melody. This would be like another 9/10 suspension. We saw one of those earlier when the bass was being suspended. B flat, D, G, and D, that'd be a 1/6 chord, and this would be the point where we could start saying the modulation happens, but because we see another G minor chord in first inversion again after this neighbor tone, B flat, G, G, and D, which is just repeating the same chord after some ornamentation, I'm going to go ahead and say that this is where the modulation occurs, and this is our 4/6 chord before we get not really any preamble where it's being tied into the cadence, but we still get a prolongation of the cadence in the lower voices. This G is a 4/3 suspension, but still implying our major tonic, and this plagal cadence brings the end of the, I guess, second section of this, I guess, larger ternary form of a chorale. This E is a lower neighbor tone as well. This F sharp is what's being implied as the third of our chord, and we're seeing this Picardy third plagal cadence where the and we don't have a sharing of basses between the G minor chord and the D major chord in this case, but we already have the precedent from the previous phrase to show that there is a relationship between these two phrases. And if you are privy to this sort of thing, you might be able to see how the next section, which consists of the rest of the chorale, how that's going to end. So on to our third and final phrase. I do believe that this next phrase starts in the key of D minor because of this C sharp here, but we do end this short phrase with an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F. So after our D major chord, we have C sharp, A, E, and A, which is 5/6, A major over C sharp, and then we go to D minor, D, A, D, and F, which is our tonic triad, and I think this is where we modulate to the key of F. It is now our 6th chord. This B flat's an upper neighbor tone, or perhaps this was a deceptive progression, and this A was like a suspension that resolves upwards. I don't think that's very likely, but it's there if you want to analyze it that way. And then we have E, A, C, and C. I reckon this A is an accented non-chord tone. I don't think this is an A minor chord, again with this idea of 2 eighth notes, the inner eighth notes of a 4 eighth note group being the accented non-chord tones. I think this is actually C major over E though, 5/6, and that resolves to F major, F, F, C, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. And as a complement to the previous phrase, our next phrase is still in the key of F major and ends in a perfect authentic cadence. We start off with F major over A, F, C, and C, which is 1/6. No need to reiterate the Roman numeral. Passing tones in the upper voices and the bass, where we have B flat, F, D, and B flat, which is like a passing 4 chord, B flat major. And he then takes us to C, C, E, and A, which is like it's actually, I think this is not an A minor chord. I think this E is an accented non-chord tone, and it's really this F that's our chord tone here, which would make this F major over C, 1/6/4, which makes more sense in a cadential context, which we would expect to go to some type of 5 chord afterwards. C, C, F, and G, this F being a 4/3 suspension, but by the time we get the resolution, we also get a resolution down to B flat as well, so that would make this a 5/7 chord. We could put the bracket there as well to signify their relationship with one another. not really necessary, but it's kind of a habit stylistically from having analyzed in classes before. And then we cadence on F major, F, A, C, and F, which is our tonic triad in root position. Next phrase is another interesting one. We do go to the key of D minor, but if you look, we have maybe an argument to be made for the fact that we have some type of subdominant cadence. I don't think it's as blatant of a subdominant cadence, and I'll talk about what a subdominant cadence is because we actually haven't had one in a very long time. It was something that was very common in the early BWVs, but now that we're like into the high 200s, it's actually kind of crazy to think about. Yeah, it's not something that we've talked about all that much recently. I can't actually remember the last time specifically we've had a subdominant cadence or something that I've made the argument that there's a subdominant cadence happening, but not too long we'll get to it. But we're going to start off in the key of D minor, again where we have F major leading into the key of D minor. I'm going to call it a common chord. It's now our 3. We then have C sharp, A, E, and A. It's another 5/6 chord, A major over C sharp. Passing tone in the melody, and then we have D, A, E, and F. Bach loves this 9/8 suspension with D minor in the alto. It's our tonic triad. And then we get this really interesting modulation here, and I was wary, which one means which. That's not the point. The point is that I was hesitant to analyze this as the modulation point here, where this D led to E, G, D, and E, which, if we look at this D here, I suppose we could analyze this as like an E minor 7 flat 5 chord, but there'd be no flat 5 because the B flat is missing, and it's not found later in the context of this chord. We don't see the B flat until we hear the cadence. So I'm thinking actually this D is a 7/6 suspension over the bass. But by the time we hear it, something interesting happens. So I think what's being implied here is some type of C major chord over E. So suppose we could make an argument that this is some type of 7/6 chord, but in the key of G minor, it would be a 4/6 chord, just like we saw earlier. And then we have this F sharp here. So E natural gets turned from like 1 and 2 in the key of D minor, right? D going to E, to 6, 7, 1 in the key of G minor. So Bach flips the script on us very quickly and puts us in a bit of a pinch or a bind regarding how we analyze the modulation. But if we look at this as a 4 chord, which makes sense, we have F sharp, A, C, and E, which is F sharp minor 7 flat 5, which would be a 7 chord in the key of G minor. So we have actually here just a quick turnaround to the key of G minor through 4, going to 7, going to 1, and this modulation of 7 going to 4, remember that for a couple of seconds from now when it'll be pertinent regarding the modulation to our next key. So of course, we also have this 4/3 suspension here in the cadence here, where the C over the G creates the interval of a 4th, and we cadence on G minor, G, D, B flat, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. Apologies for the analysis kind of getting scrunched to the right a little bit, so it's not directly under the chord, but I guess technically it is under the B flat here, so it's under the beat where the chord is being implied. So for the next 2 phrases, we have a lot of harmonic activity where there are modulations happening kind of all over the place, mid-phrase modulations galore. So in order to reconcile all of the quick movements that are turning, melodic minor fragments into other keys and aligning with them, quick modulations I feel like were essential to analyze to keep the tonal narrative relevant and active. So you're going to be seeing keys in very short fragments, kind of akin to what you would see maybe in like a jazz piece, like a traditional standard jazz piece. Some people would say that Bach would have been a jazz guy. But yes, starting things off, we start with A, C, and F, another F major chord to start off the phrase, and in the key of in the key of G minor, that would be our 7 chord in first inversion, In the key of C major, however, it would be our 4 chord in first inversion. So you see, this is why I feel like this modulation was justified, was because of the fact that we see the exact same modulation moving from G minor to C major as well. And I think, you know, when you are trying to move between the two keys, you're sort of forced into using certain chords because G minor to C major is a distant modulation and they don't have many chords in common. So if you're trying to create a smooth transition between two distant keys, that is two keys that are not adjacent to one another on the circle of fifths, sometimes you need to use a chord that's less likely, and modulating over 7 is one of those tactics that Bach has at his disposal. This F is also a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it, but we're going to be in C briefly until we go to A minor. We have B, D, D, and G, which is G major over B. That's a 5/6 chord. A little brief passing tone here. This F is a 7th, but also it's an on-chord tone in this context. And then we get C, F, C, and G. This F being a 4/3 suspension over the bass as well, but we are implying a tonic here. But interestingly enough, kind of hearkening is the wrong word. I really love that word hearkening, but I guess hearkening back to the idea of quick modulations, I guess that was the proper use there. We have this B natural here happening at the same time, so we typically don't see tonic 7th chords in Bach, which makes me feel like this one chord, even though for the sake of finishing the resolution or the cadential progression in the key of C, it aligns with the idea of this being a 3/7 chord, or maybe just a 3 chord. You know what, I am going to analyze it as a 3/7 chord because the B is, that would be a little hypocritical of me because I've done this with other chords in the past. I'm going to call it a chord tone. So I don't think this is a tonic 7 chord for the sake of C major, but I think it's a 3/7 chord in the key of A minor, and that's just one of the compromises Bach is making here to move from C to A minor. Of course, the B doesn't need to be there, but it is, and the fact that it is there makes it feel more like a mediant rather than a tonic, and that's convenient because we're moving to the key of A minor. And this isn't the last modulation we're going to see. We're going to be in the key of A minor for a while until we start to see B flats, where we then are in the key of F major, which at the end of our phrase we get an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of F major. So after our 3 chord we get C, F sharp, A, and D, which is D7 over C. Did I say C sharp? No, I said C, F sharp. That would be a 4/4/2 chord, and we know where we would expect this to go. It would go to some type of chord that was in first inversion and a 5th below, typically speaking, and that's exactly what we get. We get B, G sharp, B, and D, which is 7/6. 4/4/2 going to 7/6, 4 going to 7 probably being the most common subdivided chord progression in all of the Bach chorales. We're seeing it here as well as the inversions resolving the way that we would expect, which is really nice. And that, of course, would resolve to A minor, A, C, and C, 2 roots and 2/3, but A minor nonetheless. And then we get B flat and G going on here, which is kind of interesting, which makes me feel like we are no longer in the key of A minor, and we're instead in the key of F major. I think it would be kind of hard to make the argument that once we see B flat, we are still in the key of A minor. Of course, you could make that argument if the context was right, but I don't think that a G minor chord, which I guess is technically what's happening a little bit in passing here, or E diminished, something like that, or E flat major, we're not really thinking in terms of A minor anymore. We'd be closer to the realm of F major at that point. But after our 3 chord, we get A, F, A. Did I read that right? A, F, A, and F. I think we can make the argument here that this is a tonic triad in first inversion. But at the same time, I feel like with the G and the... No, it has to be a tonic triad in first inversion. For some reason here in my notes I had it marked as a 6 chord in the key of A, which would be a D minor chord. But there's no D in the chord. Oh no, there is a D here. These are just little accented neighbor tones, or non-chord tones here. And I think this A is, even though it's a chord tone, it's this D, F, A, and F, which is actually going on here, which is a 6 chord. I think that that's actually what's being implied, rather than a tonic triad being implied here. This is just counterpoint going on, so this A I don't think actually is the base of the chord. I think this D is what's being implied as the base of the chord in the grand scheme of things, rather than 3 going to 1 going to 6. It makes a lot more sense for 3 to go to 6 via the cycle of falling fifths, and then we would expect some type of 2-5-1 progression afterwards, and conveniently speaking, that's exactly what we get. We have B flat, F, D, and G, which is G minor 7 over B flat. You know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords in cadential situations. And then we have C, E, C, and G, which is our 5 chord, C major in root position. And then we cadence on F major, F, F, C, and A, which is our authentic cadence in the key of the tonic after a series of really rapid and brief modulations. Moving on to the next phrase, we probably have the most interesting chord in the entirety of the chorale here to analyze, but there is less modulation going on. Just like our previous phrases in the key of D minor, I do think we start things off here in the key of D minor with an F major chord, F, C, F, and A, which doesn't need to be reanalyzed in the key of F, but in the key of D minor I would reanalyze it as 3. We have some passing tones in the upper voices before we get B flat, C, D, and F, this C being a 9/8 suspension over the bass, this B flat being our chord tone, which I think is 6. So 3 going to 6, that's a good sign. That is a transitive, this is the opposite of transitive. This is following the cycle of falling fifths, so that's a good sign. So instead of 3 going directly to 5, we're seeing 3 go to 6, which follows more of the natural order of how the chords want to flow through the major or minor scale. And here's the interesting chord, E flat, G, D, and G. This is a really interesting chord, and to be entirely honest with you, this would be some type of E flat major chord, and I don't know how to make ends of it. I mean, like, I have my theories, but the reason why Bach chose E flat here rather than B flat is most likely because he didn't want to jump up a tritone. He went from F to B flat, and then he would go from B flat to E, which would be an augmented fourth. Maybe he wanted to avoid that, but really going to this E flat here really implies that we're in G minor, right? Because we have the B flat and the E flat, but no, we're still in the key of D minor, because right after that he does the turnaround to C sharp, and then it goes right back to D. But we're going to find that he actually doesn't even reference G minor in more than just this E flat here. He goes to A minor afterwards, which is very interesting. I guess kind of alluding to the beginning of the chorale where we start in the key of A minor. But after this, I think this is some type of Neapolitan chord, and we haven't really talked about Neapolitan chords in this series because I'm not sure if they really came into style until after Bach's time. You do see them a little bit in Bach's music, but I think this E flat here, we could be doing like a chain of dominance here, like F being 5 of B flat, and then B flat being 5 of E flat. But ultimately what ends up happening here is we are outlining some type of, some semblance of the falling fifths progression. So I am going to call this some type of Neapolitan chord, this D being some sort of suspension, and this B flat actually being the, I guess, the trajectory of the resolution. I guess you could maybe call it some type of like Neapolitan 7th chord, not a Neapolitan 6th, right? The textbook will talk about the Neapolitan chord as sort of a substitute for 2, rather than 2 going to 5. We have flat 2 going to 5, and that's actually what we get here. So we have 3-6 flat 2, C sharp, G, A, and A, which would be some type of 5-7 chord, 5-6-5 more specifically. This F being a little brief passing tone here before we go to D minor, D, F, A, and F. So when you look at the big picture, you see that it's actually not as complicated from a progressional standpoint, because we have 3-6, and if you look at this Neapolitan as flat 2, Suppose we can just call it flat 2 as well, just so that we can see the numbers relationship. It just is a 3, 6, 2, 5, 1 progression. But the choice of E flat rather than E natural, as opposed to just inverting the chord maybe, right? Because we would be expecting some type of E chord here. We could have kept the B flat the same. We could have gone down to G, then up to C sharp. I guess that would have created the same distance as well. There were lots of different, actually, yeah, if we were B flat, there would be an augmented 7th. How would we, or augmented 2nd rather, augmented 7th is just an octave, or sounds just like an octave. Yeah, I guess it would be kind of difficult to avoid that awkward interval, so I feel like Bach is just doing that to avoid the ascending, diminished, or augmented 4th here. Pretty interesting stuff, but it makes sense, you know, there's logic behind it, even though it sounds kind of quirky and out of place, because really, you know, I guess this E flat is sort of enclosing this D natural here, which the C sharp is also doing. So maybe this E flat's just functioning as an upper leading tone rather than a lower leading tone. But yes, that's all I really wanted to talk about regarding that. The E flat, definitely the maker's mark, the chef's kiss of this particular chorale. And after our tonic triad here, I do think this is where we move to the key of A minor. It is now our 4 chord, and we start to see things that are indicating A minor for us. We have G sharp here, we have a C natural and B natural going down to A, G sharp here as well, B natural, lots of flashing arrows pointing us towards A minor. But this D is a chord tone, this B flat. Yeah, that B flat being there too, that's kind of interesting. Have we modulated yet? Yeah, I think we've modulated. I think this B flat is actually, yeah, no, I think we had to have modulated here. Modulated. Yeah, we must have modulated by this point just because of the fact that we would, yeah. Oh no, that's not a B flat. See, this is what I'm confusing myself. I think I miss, is that no, it is a B flat. Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, so I guess that B flat does remain there. It is kind of interesting. Again, I guess you could sort of look at it as an upper leading tone surrounding the A here, which is exactly what the G sharp is doing. So maybe there is a connection here between this E flat and this B flat, but it really makes sense for the modulation to occur here, because anything after this point you're getting G sharps, and eventually you're going to cadence on A major, which is diatonic to D minor if you are including the leading tone, but this definitely does not feel like a half cadence, that's for sure. This feels much more like an imperfect authentic cadence, despite the fact that the 5th of the chord is in the melody. This chorale is filled with all sorts of different deviations away from what we are expecting in terms of cadential norms. So after our 4 chord, we have D, G sharp, B, and E, which is E7 over D. That's 5-4-2. And if you know about 4-2 chords, you know pretty much where they always resolve. C, A, and E. They resolve to a chord a 5th below. That's in first inversion, and that's exactly what happens here. A minor over C, before we get B, D, A, and D. This A being a 7-6 suspension over the bass. We're actually getting B, D, G sharp, and D, which is 7-6 in, I was about to say 7-6 in first inversion. No, 7 in first inversion, which is a 7-6 chord. And if you have seen this progression in the past, you know it's going to be on the other side of it. It's going to be a tonic triad in root position. But in this case, it happens to be major, which is pretty cool. But as Bach often does with minor chorales, he will cadence in the key of the minor dominant, but use a Picardy third to then elide very naturally into the final phrase, which is in the key of the overall tonic of the piece, and that is D minor, which is implying that this A major chord is our 5 chord. Then we get a deceptive progression leading into our final cadence, which, if you remember from the fact that this chorale is sort of like ternary form in terms of the fact that we have 3 sections, they all end in a plagal cadence. We go from A major to B flat, F, D, and D, which is a 6 chord in root position, passing tones in the lower voices. G, A, C, and D. Most likely this F sharp here is actually our chord tone. Here we have F sharp, A, C, and D. Now here's actually what's really interesting. I think, have we modulated to the key of G minor before the end of our phrase? It's quite possible because we have F sharps pretty... Yeah, you know what? I think we have to do that. I think this has to be a direct modulation to the key of G minor to be consistent with the other phrases. Not that it has to be consistent, but I think it makes sense for us to get a modulation to G minor at the end because the harmony is really doing a lot of the same thing here. So sorry to walk that back. This B flat major chord would be 3, but this would actually be consistent with a lot of the phrases we've been getting in D minor where we start with a 3 chord. We're just in G minor now, starting with a 3 chord. We then have F sharp, A, C, and D, which is 5, 6, 5. We've seen 3 to 5, 6 very frequently throughout this chorale. And then we have G, A, B flat, and D. We know that G minor is being implied here despite the 9/8 suspension in the tenor. This A is a passing tone, sort of echoing what's being suspended. And then we get this A sharp here, which sort of implies this idea of a little bit of a passing 5, 4, 3 chord. D7 over A, and then we go to with a B. No, this is a G natural, sorry, not a G sharp, and I think that's because we saw a G sharp earlier. Oh no, we saw a G sharp in the previous measure, that's why. So here we get B flat, G, G natural, and D, which would be 1, 6. We see Bach switch up the suspension because the bass gets up, ends up getting changed with a lot of frequency in the chorales. It's one of the more common things he does. And after this 1, 6 chord, I do think we modulate back to the key of D minor here. And we're going to call this a 4, 6 chord. G, B flat, G, and D. We kind of turn into root position here after this passing tone in the alto. And then we get ready for our final cadence, which takes our 4 chord, turns it into second inversion. And then here with this F sharp and this A, we get a tonic triad in root position. Back to 4, 6, 4 again on the next beat. This E natural and this G here are lower, they're non-chord tones regardless, and they're going to approach our tonic, our major tonic, in root position at the end. And that is our analysis for today. Wow, this is the longest video I've ever made by a long shot, by over half an hour. Wait, over half an hour? Over 20 minutes, that's for sure. But this is an absolute monster of a chorale. I am beat. But there's so much to talk about regarding this chorale as far as my closing thoughts are concerned. We have minor dominance. At the beginning here, this opening phrase is characteristically modal in comparison to the rest of the chorale. It kind of feels like in Gregorian chant, the cantor sings an incipit, which is like the lead-in that, I guess, well, it's a lead-in that leads the rest of the ensemble or the rest of the singers to sing. And this is sort of what this opening phrase feels like. It has a very unique old world profile in comparison to the rest of the phrases, which feel much more modern regarding Bach's vocabulary. But other than that, we have the Neapolitan chord, or I guess what could be categorized as a Neapolitan chord, a flat 2 chord as a predominant, pretty interesting. We modulate using minor dominant as well, adds to the very interesting profile of this introductory phrase. We have tons of mid-phrase modulations in this chorale, going from G to D minor in more of a tamer fashion here, and in more of an extreme fashion we have, D minor to C major, and then we have C to A to F, and then D to A, where the phrase starts in a different key and ends in an entirely different key, where there's a modulation that happens in the middle of the phrase. That's what I mean by a mid-phrase modulation. Lots of chromatic lines where we have little ascending chromatic figures, both in the bass and in other lines as well. Let's see if we can find any of those. Sorry, there's a lot of real estate here, and with my markings it's harder to see the chromatic tones. And when I'm talking about a chromatic line like this, I'm talking about the idea, like here, for example, C natural, C sharp, D, where we see a series of chromatic half steps all going in the same direction. We often get interesting harmony over these stints of long chromatic half steps, and in more extreme cases in Bach, we see Bach use 5 or 6 different chromatic half steps in the same direction. But even when we see 3 in a row, it's we typically get an interesting chord progression there. The fact that it ends in a non-authentic cadence, we sort of take that a little bit for granted because, as we've talked about, the chorale is kind of a series of 3 sections, and all of them end with the same style of Plagal cadence of G minor going to D major. So the fact that it doesn't end in authentic cadence is more justified than other chorales that kind of unusually don't end in authentic cadences. And I think... Oh, and a secondary deceptive progression where we go from 5 of 3 to 1, where you could make the argument 3 is happening here, but it really does sound like we have E major going to F major, which is a pretty hip sound, and one of the lesser common configurations of secondary deceptive progressions. But on that note, I think that's everything I wanted to talk about regarding today's chorale. If you're interested in following me along on the journey to analyze all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You can hit the notification icon as well if you're interested in following me along. You can get notified of my daily upload that way. You could also like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that more people see the videos, and that's very helpful for me as a content creator. But with all that being said, thank you so much for watching the video and supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.